It was the dead of Russian winter of February 1987. I remember that winter very, very well. If you touched anything metal, you risked having your skin ripped off. A small group of dedicated volunteers landed on the site of former burnt-out school in the center of Russia, 70 miles south of Moscow, to begin the construction of the future campus of the first Protestant institution of higher learning in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics after 70 years of communist atheism. The site of the burnt-out school was a horrific image. If we could have the next slide, please. When the school burned down, 3 floors of structure collapsed, creating massive debris, mountains of garbage. After decades, trees grew inside, and the basement of the building was turned by the villagers who built themselves another school on the other side of the railway. They turned the basement into a local garbage dump. When our first teams moved in that February in sub-zero temperature, it was humanly impossible to empty and clean the basement. About 70 metal picks, or as the British call them, crowbars, were acquired. No machinery was available to us at the time. Soviet Union was going through a major economic collapse as a massive government machine, and the economy of the country paralyzed and disintegrated. Nothing was yet created to replace that vertically controlled, bureaucratic monster. Many of our people, in order to begin the construction, withdrew their life savings. Those who were sacrificing their careers, their health, the stability of their employment, children of those, many of whom died in Stalin's labor camps, for just writing to the government to request the permission to open an institution of higher learning for God's church in the Soviet Union. When the villagers, the local villagers, saw the spirit of sacrifice of strangers who were arriving from different parts of that huge 11-time zone nation, non-believers were touched by God. Communists, government officials began to bring food, money, clothes for our people to that site. No machinery was available for the use of the volunteers. So if you could just visualize 15 to 17 feet of debris and decomposed carcasses of dead animals and garbage frozen straight through into the deep. And as the building was collapsing inside from fire, massive old cast iron boiler system fell through into the basement. It took 2 months and 300 volunteer men and women working around the clock in shifts with metal picks and wheelbarrows and pulleys that they have engineered themselves during the nights between the shift to lift the heaviest parts of the old cast iron boiler and to clean, drain, and dry the entire basement. Everything in the basement had to be removed. Also, just the shell of gaping holes with former windows was left. For the new interfloor structure, metal beams had to be used. Some of the leading architects in Moscow risked their careers to help us, but eagerly wanted to be a part of this amazing miracle. Non-Adventists, entirely new people whom God touched and motivated, engineered the design and the restructuring of the beautiful, lavish exterior of the restored building. Heavy metal beams had to be hitchhiked to the site. Yes, I did not make a mistake. They had to literally be hitchhiked from locations 4 to 5 hours away from Zaoksky. Our acquisitions guys had no bribes to give out to the corrupt system, only Bibles in place of a bribe. And the Bible was a rarity in Russia at the time. People for 70 years, 7 decades, literally almost 4 generations, did not see a Bible, did not touch a Bible. Smuggled Bibles were burned at the borders by hundreds of thousands, at the borders of the entire Soviet Union, as the smugglers continued to bring them into Russia. Even that unreadable, old, almost ancient 1876 edition of the Russian synodal translation. That translation, which if you read it now, if young people in Russia read it now, where it says in Russian that God created the world in 6 days and he rested on the 7th day, the word that is used for rested in the old Russian, pachil, for people of your generation in Russia today, it means passed away. So God created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day, he passed away. And when Soviet officials of state factories would see even those Bibles, they would hear that a research institution, a first Christian research institution, will be built where the new translation of the Bible will be prepared, where young men and women will be trained to spread the gospel. They would say to our acquisitions guys, you know, actually, I've got about 6 or 7 of those huge metal beams lying there in the yard behind the factory building. You can have them. I don't need them if you can figure out where to get the crane and the truck to deliver them to your site. And our acquisitions guys prayed for the miracle to take place. And God responded each time. And they delivered them on time. Then the driver would be driving them along the highway for 2.5, 3 hours, and then he would come to the side of the road, stop the truck, and would say, you know, guys, I have to go completely different direction now. And you better figure out how to stop another crane and get your beams out of my truck and act fast because I am on a deadline. And they had to do that. And it was possible through prayer. And they would wait for another crane to drive by and another truck. And I remember very well how when they would arrive to our site with no machinery, 36 volunteer pastors would come to the truck, would give their shoulders, would get the beams and bring them down. And they had to position the beams with a pulley that they have generated. There was a government construction going on in the village that nobody cared about. They were absolutely abandoned. They were drinking vodka during lunchtime on their construction site. And when our people would come to them and would ask them, can we have your crane? Can we borrow your crane? For just 15 minutes, we will be able to lay 5 more beams. They would look at them and say, you can have it for 4 hours. We don't need it today at all. You can have it, take it. We bonded with many local people. Conversions began to take place. Churches were springing up around the construction site. National television crews were sent to the site by government television that was now in the hands of the democratic forces of the new Russia, as Russia was opening to freedom of the media, freedom of the press. They were coming to film the miracle. People in different parts of the Soviet Union would donate their life savings. There was one German-Russian immigrant who was heavily persecuted during Stalin's regime period. And when communism collapsed, he established a little marble cutting plant somewhere behind the Urals, a 2-day journey by train from the construction site. When he heard about the opportunity and what God was doing there at Zaoksky, he closed his factory. He packed everything on 3 freight cars, and he donated his entire marble cutting plant to Zaoksky and came himself there with his family because he said God's house deserves the best materials. God's house deserves the best architecture. The villagers were amazed, and they asked me once at the railway station, what are your guys doing there every day? You know, we see them, they work through the morning, and then they come out during lunchtime. We see that they built themselves a massive dining, rough wooden table. They gather around it, they stand around it, they yell something real loud, then they sit down, eat fast, and go back to work. What do they yell? And I got puzzled initially, and then I thought and I realized, and I told them, oh, they actually don't yell anything. They stand around the table, they pray, and then they say a very loud amen, and then they sit down and eat. And as what I saw taking place there is that people were transformed there. They got a new joy, a meaning to their life, friendship and hope. And when the local population saw what was emerging there, they were astounded. And I would like actually to show you a photograph of what emerged through the restoration and the miracle that took place. If we could have the next slide of how the campus later developed there at Zauksky. Could we have the next slide, please? I actually heard, if we could have the next slide, I actually heard from a psychologist that you need 3 things to live a happy life. You actually need 3 things. You need something to do, self-actualization, somebody to love, acceptance and affirmation, and something to look forward to, hope. That's what you need. And I saw how at the construction site, all of those 3 things were taking place, and much more, much, much more. You know, the passage that we reflected on often there at Zauksky at the time puts it even into a deeper and better language. In the Old Testament gospel, in the book of the ancient greatest Hebrew poet, the Hebrew Shakespeare, prophet Isaiah, in chapter 58, there are 2 amazing gems, verses 10 and 11 in Isaiah 58. I never understood them the way I understood them then and there during the construction at Zauksky. And particularly one experience helped me to understand the passage. As we were continuing the construction, some of the local active people came to us and they said to us, "Do you know, guys, you are working miracles here. But just about 7 miles away from where you are, there is an abandoned orphanage that still has many orphans. And the roof has collapsed and it is dilapidated. And the orphans are dying there from pneumonia and from cold. Can you guys come and help? Can you do something?" And the local hospital people came and said, "The economy has collapsed in the nation. Our hospital is about to collapse. Can you do something for us, guys?" And I remember very well how one morning one of the volunteer pastors read this passage to us. If you spend yourself on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like noonday. The Lord will guide you continually. This is why it all happened, what was happening there. And this is why the Lord is calling us to respond to the need around us. He will then satisfy your needs in sun-scorched lands and in the dead of Russian winter. And He will strengthen your frame, and you will be like a spring whose waters never fail. And if initially some of the local communist leaders in the village were very jealous when they saw the construction and the contours of the new architectural building, that it was beginning to look not just big and good, but was beginning to look beautiful and inspiring, higher than the local Communist Party headquarters, they got very, very jealous. And they halted the construction right at the height of the process. And then some of the local guys, the local villagers, went up to them and said, please don't stop these guys. They are helping us. With the orphanage, you did not help us with the orphanage. You did not provide. They are helping our hospital. We need them here. Let these guys keep working. Let them continue. If you pour yourself on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light will rise from obscurity, from nowhere, from the Soviet underground, and your own adversity, your own grief, your own depression, your own failure, your own rejection and darkness will become like a noonday. Why? Because the Lord will guide you continually. You know the secret? When we go, when there are the needy, the hungry, where there is oppression, lack of freedom, where there is grief and loss and humiliation of human beings created by God, we actually go to the territory where God is, where God is working. And we begin working with Him. And then He guides us continually. John Wesley reflected on this passage there in England. He reflected on those Hebrew words and how to render them better. He wrote in his diary, if you pour yourself on behalf of the needy and the hungry, that is when you draw out or open, when we open a store to satisfy the wants of the needy. Pour out your soul, he wrote down. That is when you pour out your affection, your pity, your compassion. Then your own darkness will be lit with God's light. When we give freely and cheerfully from the principle of charity that is completely selflessly, God changes us. I remember during the construction process, I had to go to one government official in the town nearby, Alexin town in the Tula region, to plead that he would issue us a permit to launch the heating, the boiler system, the new boiler system. And he was spoiled, corrupt person. He looked at me, and I noticed that he was uneasy, that he was shaking. And he said to me, so I guess I really have to help you, right? And I said, thank you. And he said, you know why I have to help you? Because I had a very good friend in Odessa, in Ukraine. He was in charge of a large factory there, and one day Baptists came to him and pled with him to help with the construction of their church, and he refused, and he died the next day. And I also will never forget another gentleman in Tula, where before the coming of winter, in acute need of concrete mixers for the construction, I pled for an opportunity to be allowed to be received by him. And when I was actually permitted into his office, it was a massive hall. I was walking along the aisle to a massive oak desk. And as I was approaching, he rose up, and with open arms, he invited me to sit down. And he asked me, how can I help you? What do you need? You are a Christian. My son is a drug addict. Can you help him? Can you pray for him? Have you got a Bible? How can I help you? And I said that we urgently need 5 concrete mixers, electrical concrete mixers. He said, do you have it in a letter? And he pulled out an expensive pen and wrote out, please immediately release 5 concrete mixers and make sure they are delivered to the site today, and handed the letter back to me. Because God himself, the Jehovah, will surprise you when you go with him. With a return of mercy after your great affliction, when you give of yourself completely until it hurts. Jesus put this message in Isaiah 58 into even more profound, realistic, practical, and beautiful perspective, healing perspective for us. Do you remember in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 28 through 31? You remember that passage, how the disciples just witnessed how a rich young ruler from the elite of the land rejected Jesus' call to discipleship. And they were astounded. And Peter's mind was racing. He was figuring things out. And he had a quick tongue. You know what Peter was like. And he said to Jesus, Lord, what about us? What about us? Is it worth for us? We have left everything to follow you. And Jesus replied to Peter, I tell you the truth. No one who has left home, or brothers, or sisters, or mother, or father, or children, or fields for me and the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age. Homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and fields, and with them persecution, and in the age to come, eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. Is it true that a Christian life of selflessness is worth living? Christ said it is worth living. Because if you search and search, you will not find a selfless person in the history of humanity who genuinely gave up that it hurt, gave up everything for the Lord, who has not experienced the lasting peace of God, the lasting joy of Christ, and the joy of working with the Lord. And Jesus added 2 important clarifications. He said, yes, you will get it back 100-fold. Homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and lands, and with them persecution. Not quid pro quo, not material reward for material sacrifice, as William Barclay reminds us. You know what it speaks of? Barclay says it speaks of the utter, absolute honesty of Jesus. It is not an easy way. It is a costly way. Jesus never used the Russian method of bribing people to follow them, giving them unrealistic promises. He rather challenged them. Certainly you will get your reward, but you yourself will have to show yourself big enough woman and a big enough man for God and a gallant enough adventurer to get it. Today, there is such an opportunity. Today, there is a possibility for us to become fountains, to touch lives. If you ever go to Zaoksky in Russia, make sure you meet my friend Yelena Rudoy, who came over here and helped us with fundraising for our Bible project last February. As we were driving along New Hampshire to the service, she was looking at the churches to the left and to the right. Yelena's history is amazing. She was a young graduate 20 years ago from the most prestigious conservatory in the Soviet Union. And together with thousands who were attracted to that site, she came. I remember one day she entered my office and she put her diploma on my desk and she said, "I want to be useful here. Do you have something for me here?" Today, Yelena is giving Christian concerts, is praising God through song in hundreds and hundreds of concert halls across Russia, and leading a flourishing music department as the Dean of Music at Zaoksky. As we were driving along New Hampshire, she looked at these church buildings and she said, "There are my brothers here, my sisters over here. This is my land. I have relatives here. God gave me relatives in every country of the world." Yelena's mom is now an amazing activist. Her dad, who abandoned her and turned away from her, is her best friend now. That is what we can experience this new year. This is how God can shine into our darkness, into our loss, and can bring us His healing, His peace, and His joy. And when we'll be hearing our final song this morning, let us ask ourselves, is it worth to give everything for Christ?